Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's program, Smart Shopping for Kidney Health, Making the Most of Local Stores. I'm Tori, and I'm the Program Manager for NKF Greater New York. We are so excited to be hosting this program, and to everyone tuning in, thank you for joining us. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We'd like to ask everyone who has joined for
Neil here.
Zoom to please keep yourself on mute. And we also encourage all of you to ask questions and we will answer them at the end. So if you're joining us from Zoom,
Am I on
feel
my
free to ask your
countdown?
questions in the chat box. And if you're tuning in on Facebook, please ask your questions in the comments. We'll answer everyone's questions at the Q&A portion of the presentation. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. Our first speaker tonight is Kimberly Oliveira. She is a registered dietitian with a passion for cooking based in New York City. She works at the Rogosin Institute, helping kidney patients take charge of their diet to improve their health and slow disease progression. Her goal is to aid in simplifying healthy eating and making dietary restriction enjoyable. And our next speaker tonight is Cecilia Santana. Cecilia Santana is a wellness ambassador for the Rogosin Institute, where she and her colleagues serve as peer mentors and advocates, sharing their firsthand experiences with the kidney patients and educating them about renal replacement treatment options, healthy food choices, and the importance of following care plans. So with that being said, I will pass it off to Kimberly and Cecilia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about shopping for healthy foods, especially for kidney disease in areas where supermarkets can sometimes be a little bit hard to come by. So when we think about shopping for healthy foods, traditionally the first thing that comes to our minds is, fancy food supermarkets, the bigger supermarkets such as Whole Foods as well. And the reality is we can find pretty much healthy foods in most places that we go, whether that's the local corner store or little mini markets, local bodegas, or even the dollar store. Most of these establishments, they will have some sort of a healthy whole food staple, whether that's frozen produce, canned produce, freeze-dried food, along with dried food. Anything that we can keep in our pantries, we can build upon that to have a healthy diet, including staples like the pasta and grains and beans. While we may go once or twice to, a bigger supermarket to do a monthly shop, we can always incorporate these smaller stores to our advantage so that we're having a healthy diet on a day-to-day basis. So when it comes to shopping, a big thing that we want to pay attention to is our labels. So label reading is the most important skill that we can have for our benefit for our kidneys and for our diet in general. Pardon me. And so sometimes your needs will be a little bit different. So one person may need to restrict a little bit more of potassium or eat less salt, eat less protein. And that's something that you should be talking to your doctors and your healthcare team, and they will definitely guide you. But on that note, we can also use the food labels as a really big tool to understand whether a food or a serving size is appropriate for our kidneys. So it will depend. For example, it's very easy to rush into a store and grab the first thing that we see and just go to the counter and pay for it. But there are, some easy rule of thumbs that will make it easy, even if it's a quick glance and you only have 2 seconds because, you don't have time or the store is busy and you don't want to be in anyone's way. So at a quick glance at this table, I have an example on screen. We can see if, for example, you are limiting potassium because your labs come back consistently and your potassium is high, you may want to pay attention to what you're putting in your body. So as a rule of thumb, if you are really quick and you want to be in and out, you look at the potassium content on the table and you can look at the percentages. So if it's anywhere between 3% or lower, most likely that's it's a low potassium option. It's pretty relatively safe on the potassium concentration. you can have that portion. Always pay attention to portion sizes on containers so that way you're not overeating by accident. And then if you see it that it's 6% and above, and you're someone who at this time needs to be paying more attention to how much potassium you're having, that 6% or higher is going to be a little too much for your kidneys to handle at once. So we want to make sure that we are always paying attention to those percentages. Those are very important to keep your health and to keep your kidneys happy. And another easy rule of thumb that's pretty fast to identify is how much salt or sodium that we're consuming. You know, salt and sodium has a really big impact on how your blood pressure is, and also it just affects your overall health with your kidneys. So if you are going into the market and you're picking something up and you see that it has some salt in it and you really need that quick rule of thumb, anything that's 5% on the salt or below or sodium, it is considered low sodium. You can eat a little bit about it and it won't be an issue. But when we start getting to the 15% or higher, if you're doing a really quick look, that's when we have to be very more cautious about how much we're having of this food item, because it will affect a little bit your blood pressure when you are eating higher concentration of salt. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So it can be very tempting to just go in and look at that nutrition label and not really pay attention to the ingredients. However, I have an example here. It was taken by our lovely Cecilia, where when you looked at the nutrition label, it looked perfectly fine. It had low sodium, low potassium. It looked like a good overall option if you're just paying attention to that table. However, when we start digging a little bit and looking at the ingredients, we can see here that it has two things that really stand out to me. One is that it has potassium sorbate. Whenever you see that word potassium, it usually is an additive. Sometimes it's just to make things last longer on the shelves and shelf stable. And for most people, it is completely fine. However, when we have our kidney disease, we have to be a little bit more cautious because the potassium does build up over time. And if you can also see it, it has grapefruit juice. So grapefruit, you may have heard from a provider, a healthcare provider before, it does have some interactions with medication. So things like statins, which is a cholesterol drug, or even our transplant drugs, it can make it less effective. And we really don't want that happening, especially because our health is so important. So making sure that you're looking at ingredients and you're trying to avoid these big ingredients that have issues and can affect your medications is also very important for you to identify. Okay. And Cecilia, what is your experience with reading labels? What have you seen and what really stands out to you?
Well, Kimberly, I'm so glad that I'm joining all of you here because, as always, I feel that even with as much as what I've learned, I'm learning even more. I didn't have this kind of information that Kimberly has just presented before about the percentages, but I knew that seeing labels with 275 sodium or potassium and above, you're really going high. Just looking at some of, say, frozen foods that I'd be interested in having at home for a quick meal, for a quick lunch, they're through the roof. And so the only thing that I felt that really helped me throughout my dialysis journey was making sure that I chose the kinds of foods that would not be so high in those contents, in the potassium, in the sodium, etc. That was really my way of controlling how I could do during my dialysis treatments, because at the end of the month, I would receive, my labs, and they'd say, "What? Wait a minute, what did you eat this time around?" So it really made the difference. And I felt if there was one thing that I could control was that, looking at the labels, trying to determine for myself, okay, this is just too much, and going from there. So.
Okay, and if you can skip this slide, please. Oh, yes, I can go over that percentage again. So for the potassium, it looks like anything 3% and below, that is, yeah, thank you. The 3% or below for potassium is low, on the low spectrum. Anything between 3 and 6% is a medium range. So that will really depend on where you are with your potassium, if you need to be a little bit more cautious. And you can always work with your providers to identify how many times a week you maybe want to include this the medium range. And then 6% or above for potassium is pretty high. So we want to avoid that, especially if you're having sorry, if you're really having problems with your blood work and you're consistently high, you might want to look around, especially things that are, a day-to-day basis for you, and make sure that you're trying to avoid hitting that 6% mark. And then for the sodium, 5% or below tends to be on the low sodium range. Anywhere from 5 to 15% is a medium amount of salt. And then 15% and above, I just recommend not consuming, and that's just across the board. Okay. So get back to that. Yes. So drinking water, we think is safe, right? So this is something that I have seen recently more and more frequently, that sometimes even water, we have to pay attention to our labels. So this water was marketed, for example, in having electrolytes added to it. And so when we look at the label, you can see there it has D-potassium phosphate, which phos, so the letters PHOS, usually indicate that there's a phosphorus added to that. And the potassium as well, it means that potassium was added. It could be added in this case just to help rehydration and taste, but with the kidney disease, we do have to pay attention to making sure we're not having these additives, because over time, one bottle has 4 servings, and we don't really know how much potassium is in it because on the label it doesn't let us know. So if you're having one bottle throughout the day, that might not be a problem, but if you're having, 4, 5, 6 servings a day, you might accidentally be consuming more potassium than you would expect. And at the end of the month, when you get your labs back and your potassium is high and you can't really put your finger on it because it was something you don't expect, you don't really think that water would have something added, or a beverage might have, potassium added to it, especially if it's not written on the label. Cecilia, have you had any experiences where the labels did not make sense with the food, or it just took you aback?
It's interesting because I never paid attention, and through the years that I was on dialysis, this was something that was up and coming. So now it's really popular. But I guess when you think about something that contains electrolytes and minerals, those are the things that our kidneys could work with before, and we could, digest our food, and it would go through our kidneys and it was fine. And these are things that would be a plus to us. Never did I think that water was something that I had to worry about. And now with all these, power waters and, electrolytes and the marketing of the push of the waters. Yes, drinking water is good. But again, as dialysis patients, we have to maintain a certain amount of drinking water. That wouldn't help us. So it was a revelation. It was very interesting to learn that sometimes I really had to pay attention, even if someone was getting me, oh, I'll get you a bottle of water. and they're not getting just regular spring water or something. So I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because I'm sure this is not a topic that's addressed very often.
Okay. And so another topic I want to talk about, other than the actual reading of labels, is what kind of ingredients can we find in our local delis, bodegas, mini marts, and what can we do with them? Well, it's very tempting, to go into the deli counter and just order an omelet and call it a day. As we saw, in the previous slides, sometimes our ingredients might have some additives that we're not expecting. So you have a little less control with that. So instead of ordering, for example, the omelet at the deli counter, we can also buy the ingredients and make it at home. There's some benefits to that. One of them is that you have more control on how much oil, how much salt is going into the omelet. If the vegetables that were used, for example, if it was pre-frozen, that there's no added salt or there's no preservatives in that can, make some alterations to your lab work and can affect your kidneys. But also, if you're going to the deli counter and you're ordering an omelet, it comes out to around $12 in most places in the city, for example. But if you were to get the ingredients and make it at home, it's averaging around $10 to $12 as well. But the difference is, instead of one portion, you're making around 5 portions. So there's also that need of getting the ingredients, and making the food at home is always better, just because it allows you to have control. Cecilia, in your journey, what were the big changes that you noticed, or hurdles that you encountered when you were going into, a store or ordering things, that you started noticing that was a little bit different or made you start cooking more? Because I know you are a whiz at recipes.
Well, I've really learned to modify just everything, right? I love vegetables, and as time has gone by, I've learned to eat the vegetables without adding all the salt, even when it comes to salads and things like that. But yeah, it was disconcerting to learn that there were certain foods that were my favorites, certain vegetables, et cetera, that were my favorites that I couldn't indulge in as much as before. And I did learn to make more of my own. And this way I had control of what I could put in, or just use one item instead of another. If I saw something that looked very interesting on YouTube and all, I just said, okay, I'm going to use much less of the red sauce that they're including, and maybe use a low sodium chicken broth. Again, the water is the way to go. You want something soupy, or something that has a soupy consistency or a saucy consistency. You'll be surprised what you can do, just making beans and putting in the water and letting it boil and boil. So yes, an adjustment, but it can be done. A lot of us think of the days way back when we were talking about vegetarian types of foods, and you just can't make like a quinoa, let's say. And again, depended on what a person can eat and not eat. But basically, just make it tasty. You don't just make it plain and feel like you have to eat straw or something. So it's an adjustment, but it's absolutely doable.
And the healthy staples in your pantry are always very beneficial to making those changes. I have on screen some staples. I'll go over them. These are food items that you most likely will find across the board, basically anywhere. And that is things like flours, grains like rice, sometimes quinoa, sometimes not, oats, things like canned fruits, vegetables, canned fish, canned chicken, what I call the flavor boosters. So things that are seasonings that don't have added salt, like oregano, parsley, turmeric, You can find always some sort of seasoning most places that you go. Beans and lentils also, along with things like pasta, bread, tortillas, eggs, frozen produce. So when it comes to these healthy staples, you can find them basically everywhere. These are very low cost, but when it comes to these few ingredients, the world is essentially your oyster. We can mix and match these ingredients to make various different recipes. Of course, with the canned fruits and vegetables and beans and lentils, depending on your diet, if you may need to reduce how much potassium you have, you might have to choose a different kind of fruit or vegetable. For example, instead of having tomato sauce, you might have to steer a little bit clear from the tomato sauce or use less when you are cooking. Or maybe you need to lower a little bit on the beans and making sure you're rinsing your beans to make sure that all the potassium that is in the liquid gets essentially thrown out. So that way it helps balance things a little bit better. But it doesn't mean that you have to cut, these foods 100%. I'll answer this because it was the next thing I was going to say. So, for example, tomato sauce is high in potassium. Of course, we don't want to go overboard if you have a potassium issue or if your kidneys are having a harder time with potassium. You can add half of it, half of what you usually add, or you can have a smaller amount and use other, as I say, the flavor boosters to balance out the lower red sauce that you're adding to, for example, your beans. And when it comes to foods with a higher potassium content, like the tomato sauce, it doesn't mean you have to cut it out 100%. It just means you have to be a little bit more cautious on how much you're adding and how many times in a week, for example, you're having it. A lot of these foods that are higher in potassium are very healthy for us, and we want to include them in our diets. We just have to do it a little bit more cautiously. Okay. And for example, with these ingredients that I named up here, a mix and match of even the same ingredients, you can make it different ways. For example, if you're using egg, rice, and mixed vegetables, you can make yourself a type of burrito bowl. You can also make yourself like an egg roll in a bowl and have more Asian inspired flavoring. You can make rice cakes or the rice patties with just those 3 ingredients. You've made a few different items. If you throw in, a tortilla, you can have like a burrito or a breakfast burrito or a breakfast taco as well. So when it comes to the healthy staples, using your creativity will go a long way. It may seem like you may have to change a little bit of your traditional recipes or recipes that you already know and love. For example, broccoli tends to have a little bit more potassium than cauliflower. But if you're buying frozen cauliflower or frozen broccoli, you can opt for the cauliflower or broccoli cauliflower mix over the broccoli, and you essentially substituted an ingredient that you would traditionally use. For example, if you were making chicken and broccoli and use cauliflower, and your potassium is a little less in that recipe. So when it comes to making those swaps, it can be a little bit easy. You just have to use a little bit of creativity. And I always suggest for everyone to choose 1 or 2 or 3 of those family recipes that you love and see what can you tweak. Maybe you like pasta with red sauce, and how do we make that a little bit healthier? Maybe we reduce a little bit of how much tomato sauce we're adding, and we add some mixed vegetables in the middle. So that way you're not just having just carbohydrates, but you're adding some fiber to help your body a little bit more. So Cecilia, I know we just talked a little bit about recipes before, but I would love to hear your thoughts on what it's like using some of these ingredients and incorporating them into the recipes that you already knew, you already loved, and how is that experience for you of maybe going to a drugstore or to a bodega on, when on days that you need to access, some food items, but you can't necessarily go to a supermarket.
So, one of the things that I would often do when you're talking about the flavor boosters, there are so many things in our pantry that we don't even realize that we don't commonly use as flavor boosters. For example, I've used apple cider vinegar, a touch of apple cider vinegar to add a flavor to something, a grain that I'm making, less of the sauce again, just adding a little more garlic or onion powder. And even when it comes to things that you wouldn't think of using, there's ground mustard, and I've added that to a couple of things that it's like, why would you do that? Because I'm experimenting and trying to find those different flavor boosters so that I'm not adding the sodium or the sauces or the things that we can't have. So either regular vinegar or apple cider vinegar, again, just a touch, because I don't know what I'm doing if I go overboard on things. So it's just been a gradual experimentation. Stop at the store, at the corner store, oh my goodness, I need something that's going to kick this up a notch, and just pick it up and go. And it's really I've learned a lot from it.
And if you can skip the if you can please skip the slide. So what we want to do when we are making our recipes and using the ingredients that we have is we want to try to build a healthy plate. On screen we have a example of what a healthy eating plate looks like. This may look a little bit different depending on where you are in your kidney journey. You may need a little bit more protein, you may need a little bit less protein. You may need a little bit more carbohydrates or less, depending on what your needs are. But I would say this plate is essentially what we want to have. We want to have half of our plate of fruits and vegetables. If we are being cautious with our potassium, of course, we're going to choose a little bit of the lower potassium options. So we are going to be looking more towards things like asparagus, cucumber, or lettuces, green beans, cauliflower, cabbage, if we are looking for that lower potassium fruits and vegetables. If we want to have a side of grapes or berries, apples or pears, those are also very good low potassium options that you can include in your day-to-day basis. And a quarter of the plate will look, give or take, with grains. It might be pasta, it might be rice, it might be quinoa, it might be, a variety of different things. It might be bread. I do want to preface saying that a healthy plate doesn't always need to be an actual plate. And also always having that healthy protein in there, whether that's chicken, whether that's turkey, fish, beans, lentils, we always want to incorporate that. And I know usually when we think about a healthy plate, we think about an actual plate, but it can be different. It can be, for example, a sandwich where you have your bread as the whole grains or the carbs. You can add, some tuna to that and then some vegetables, and that will be a balanced meal. And that's what our goal is for our kidneys and for our overall health, is to make sure that that plate is, or our foods are always very balanced. It might look like a tuna casserole from those pantry stables, or chicken casserole where we have, canned chicken or tuna along with some pasta and vegetables and maybe some non-dairy milk that we can use to make a casserole with, some seasonings. So that would also be an option of what a balanced plate looks like, because you got the vegetables, you got protein, and you got that grain. It could look like a vegetarian burrito where you have the tortilla, you have some beans, you have some vegetables. It really depends on what your day-to-day looks like. For breakfast, for example, you might want to make some egg bites with the pantry staples that I just talked about, with, some eggs, some of the frozen vegetables, some seasoning, and have some toast on the side. And that's a complete balanced breakfast. And for every meal, we do want to try to hit that milestone of being balanced, because overall, that's what's going to keep, your blood sugars stable, your blood pressure stable. You're making sure you're giving your body enough nutrition for your either whether you're on dialysis or if you're a CKD patient. Both of those are options that it's necessary for us to have the proper nutrition to fuel and not affect our kidneys any further. And Cecilia, how was your experience learning to balance, especially, pre-dialysis, post-dialysis, transplant? How was that experience for you? Because the diets do change a little bit along the way.
Yes, again, and I think this is something that we don't realize, or we don't come to learn about, that when we're in the midst of the earlier stages of CKD, we're being asked to lessen how much of a protein intake we have. And then we start dialysis, and then it's about starting up. And it can be confusing because we're not told ahead of time, this is what you're looking at. You're going forward, you're doing what you have to do, and then you're being asked to do a little more protein intake. So it was an adjustment for me. I thought I'd always eaten pretty well when it came to any meat protein, but I lessened it nevertheless, and then went right into dialysis and did the best that I could with bringing more of that into my life. And again, playing with the different flavor boosters and all to help me along, including even with the vegetables. I was accustomed to, the packages of frozen vegetables that came with all kinds of additives and butter and creams. I learned that I could get a package that didn't have any of that, and it was still delicious. I learned even how to eat certain vegetables that I'd never really eaten before, never thought I could eat before. After my dialysis journey and I received my transplant, I started eating celery, which is something that I thought I could never eat. And I know that as a dialysis patient, I would have had to take it easy on that anyway. But it was just interesting how, even going through my transplant journey now for about 11 years, it's still, I'm always learning. I'm always learning what I can do, what I can incorporate in my life, that I can go from, say, a canned asparagus to actually eating asparagus, even if it's not a whole lot. When I was going through dialysis, it was still better for me to choose that over something that was in a can. Again, looking at the labels and saying what's going to benefit me. And I learned how delicious certain things were, eating them more naturally.
And just also as a quick rule of thumb, there are certain things that at, a mini market or a bodega, we do want to try to avoid. We want to avoid, a lot of sauces, especially if you're ordering something. It just is really hard to, one, know exactly what's in the sauce, how much salt, how much potassium. So it's always good to avoid the sauces. It's also really good to avoid, bacon, the cold cuts, the processed meat. There's a lot of additives in it, and it tends to be high in sodium. So whenever we do go to a deli or a bodega, we do want to try to steer clear from them, along with things like cheese, the French fries, potato chips. There are alternatives. For example, if you really want something crunchy, we can always try to find unsalted pretzels. That's an option. You can have popcorn that also can satisfy that crunch, and it won't be as harsh on your kidney. And also, a lot of places now are slowly getting, apple chips, pear chips, so the dehydrated fruits. And those can also be a good option for a quick snack if that's something that you're looking at and you're going into those bodegas and corner stores for a quick snack. Also, just avoiding drinking juices and sugary drinks like soda. Juices, I always like to say, with the potassium, it can really build up fast. So if you are getting, for example, an orange juice, you wouldn't be able necessarily to eat 5 oranges in one sitting, but you can drink them pretty easy. So your potassium can skyrocket with certain juices. So also things like tomato juice, grapefruit juice, we want to avoid with the kidney diet, pomegranate juice as well, just because they can be really high in potassium. And we want to try to avoid drinking our calories and drinking our food. Every once in a while as a treat, it's okay if you're having like an apple juice or pineapple juice, but when it comes to the actual juices and sodas, we want to try to avoid it. And I also wanted to talk about a little bit about different options if you don't have an easy access to a supermarket. For example, a lot of the supermarkets nowadays, they either have their own apps or they're on, one of the delivery apps for a small fee, or sometimes even free if it's their own app that you can order ahead of time or having them delivered to you. I know winter is coming. No one really wants to schlep through the snow and come home with bunches of supermarket bags. So it's an option. It does have the downside of sometimes you can't see the labels, but if it's something that is accessible to you and you don't have a supermarket in walking distance, that might be an option. And also, something that you can always be involved if you really don't have a lot of options near your home when it comes to supermarkets is you can get involved with community gardens. We just missed the mark because usually they're open from April to October, and then they close down for winter. But it is also an option. Some of them gives you, tutorials to grow things in your own home, the smaller potted plants that are a little bit easier to control, but it also helps, with you understanding how to produce and being part of your community. A lot of the community gardens at the end of the harvest will spread the wealth. So that's also something, if you're interested, they have a few popular ones in the city, like New York City Green Thumb or New York City Restoration Project. Both of them are good options. And Cecilia, do you have any comments or anything that you wish I touched upon and I did not yet?
No, you're doing a phenomenal job as always. I excuse me, and now I'm getting a little cough because of what's going on with the fire. So excuse me, everyone. But yes, it's again all about trying to find a way to get to the foods that you need, that you require. I myself have had to visit at least 2 or 3 different supermarkets to get the kinds of meals or produce that I wanted. So I definitely understand how that can be, and it is an effort to go out and make the time to go and get what you need. For myself, that's what I committed myself to. If I wanted to get the kind of things that were better going from one neighborhood to the other, if I thought I was going to get better produce, then this is what I would do. So I realized that it is an effort, but you went out in the end, and anything that can help to get you that assistance, I say go for it, especially the examples that Kimberly has set out.
Okay. And I'd like to open the floor. If anyone has any questions, can leave them in the chat.
So we actually had a few questions submitted ahead of time, so we'll just go through those very quickly and get the ball rolling. So the first one we got was, how much protein should I be eating per day?
That will vary depending on what your diagnosis currently is. I would suggest talking to your healthcare professional. If you are in the CKD, so prior to dialysis, it might look like you have to reduce the amount. It'll again be based off of your diagnoses. I would suggest talking to your physician about it. But as a rule of thumb, before dialysis, you are most likely cutting down on the protein. During dialysis, you're most likely upping that protein intake. You'll probably need a higher consumption of protein. And on transplant, it's a medium amount, like an average person.
This person asked, how much alcohol can I drink if I can drink alcohol at all?
Okay, so that's a question I get a lot. You can drink alcohol in moderation. You know, a glass of wine once a week is not going to be an issue. I always recommend not drinking more than 2 units of alcohol in one sitting. Your kidneys really can't handle that much. But if you're having from 1 to 2, you know, glasses in a week, that's completely fine.
And then the last one we got submitted ahead of time was, can I use any salt substitutes?
So with the salt substitutes, that's a very interesting question. A lot of them, what they do is instead of having a salt, which is sodium chloride, they will substitute it for potassium chloride. So if the salt substitute is something like Mrs. Dash, which is just herb and spice based, that's completely okay. But I always recommend to double check. For example, new salt is a potassium based salt substitute. So I would always suggest reading the label to definitely see if that is a spice-based alternative or if it's a potassium-based alternative. Because with your kidney care, we do have to pay attention to how much potassium we're putting in our bodies. And
Anybody else have any questions they want to put in the chat or ask Kimberly and Cecilia while we still have them on tonight?
okay, so I see a few questions. A few of them I answered with the percentages I believe I covered. What about pasture-raised pork versus conventional or grass-fed? So there are some differences with the grass-fed and versus conventional in the sense of how much vitamins and the quality of the pork. However, if you are limiting protein, it really does not make a big difference because it is regards of how much grams of protein you're having. So if it's pasture raised, conventional, or grass fed, the amount of protein still will be the same. But the quality, I mean, the taste and the vitamins, they change a little bit. But overall, it isn't a significant difference that I would say definitely prefer pasture raised over conventional. It's just a preference in the taste and the quality, but in regards to your kidneys, it really does not make a huge difference. And let me see the following question. Okay, I am a vegetarian eating soy products approximately 3 times a week. What do you feel about soy products? Okay, Morningstar veggie burgers. Okay, so some of the soy products, there are a few in the market that have some experimental additives on it. I know Beyond Burgers, one of them, that while there isn't enough studies to say that it is negative impact on your kidneys, they also don't suggest that it's positive. It's kind of in a range where we don't know enough yet with some of them. But when it comes to, for example, Morningstar, where the ingredients are pretty clear, it says, you know, soy, salt, I'm pretty confident that it's fine if you're doing it 3 times a week. It should not be an issue at all. I would just say be a little bit more cautious with the vegetarian burgers that have a little bit more of unknown additives while you're eating them. Okay. And any other questions or concerns?
Kimberly, I saw a question about canola oil
Okay, yeah.
or a comment regarding canola oil. So if there's anything you could say about the different oils, I think that would be helpful.
Yes. So in regards to the canola oil, I always prefer olive oil, but there is a little catch. Some oils cannot be heated up to a certain amount of heat. So for example, when it comes to olive oil for sauteing or for baking or for cooking, it really is not suggested because they do cause some chemicals in your bodies to raise a little bit. So it can be over time, it can cause damages to your body. So when it comes to the canola oil, if it is in moderation, there's not enough studies saying that it is negatively impact your health. So it really depends on preference. I personally use canola oil and sunflower oil. I know now it's getting popular in saying that to avoid seed oils, but at the current moment, there's not a lot of scientific evidence suggesting that we should be avoiding it. And in moderation, oils in general, we have to eat in moderation anyways. So if you are using, the olive oil for finishing and for salads, that's completely fine. I just don't suggest heating up olive oils. And if you're not comfortable with, canola oil, there's always other oils like peanut oil that you can add, coconut oil. There's, pardon me, there's those are the two that I always recommend, coconut or the peanut oil. With coconut, you have to be a little bit careful because it is a saturated fat, despite it being vegetable based. So again, you would be able to include it, but in moderation.
And again, with the coconut oil, isn't that something where it's potassium, the issue of potassium?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, no, just because it is the oil and not, for example, the milk or the fruit. The oil is essentially just the fat molecule, so there's not really any minerals in it or any electrolytes. So it's pure fat molecule, so it's pretty okay to use, again, in moderation, just because it is saturated. Okay, so if you use it in excessive amounts, it can clog your arteries faster. Okay. Does bacon or sausage matter if CKD, if it's pasture raised or in moderation? I always say you can eat anything in moderation if it's a treat. When it comes to sausage and bacon, I will say because it is processed, majority of them, I would look at the label and making sure that there's not a lot of additives, and I definitely would see how much salt is in it. Just because naturally the sausage and the bacon, they both tend to have higher amounts of salt with the production of them. So if it's something that you're having, 2-3 times in a month, I wouldn't be that concerned. But if it's more than that, definitely make sure that you're reading those labels, you're making sure there's no potassium or phosphorus added to it, along with making sure that it is below that 15% of salt added to it. Okay. Is it tomato sauce or tomato period with potassium? It is tomatoes in general. I always say to most patients, while eating a whole tomato every single day might cause your potassium to skyrocket. If you're having, 5 cherry tomatoes or a slice of tomato on a sandwich, that should be completely okay. With a lot of the potassium-rich foods, it is portion control. So depending on how much you eat and how much frequency it is, yes, it can be, it can increase your potassium and make your labs have very, very high potassium. But if you are having it in moderation, for example, on a salad, you're having 2 slices of tomato, twice a week, 3 times a week, it should not be a big issue. What cheeses are better? So with the cheeses, there's a lot of cheese on the market. But I always suggest making sure that you're looking at the labels because the salt in the cheese really does impact. So for example, feta and Parmesan, they tend to have more sodium in it versus a low sodium mozzarella. With the cheese, we do have to eat in moderation just because there is phosphorus and there is potassium in all cheeses. Cream cheese and like a lot of the softer softer cheeses that are spreadable, they tend to have less potassium and phosphorus added to them. And then you have to mainly pay attention to the sodium content. But with the majority of cheese, like I said, you have to read the label to make sure that it is on the lower end of the salt and the lower end of the potassium, and be very cautious about the portion sizes of cheeses because they can vary a lot depending on what cheese you're having. And any more questions? Let's see. Good. All right.
All right. Well, if there aren't any more questions, we will wrap it up. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much, Kimberly and Cecilia, for making tonight possible. I will be sending everybody a survey link. We'd love your feedback on the program. We appreciate your support so much and your commitment to the National Kidney Foundation programs. Be sure to check out our website for upcoming programs and for any nutrition resources. If there are any questions that we missed today, please feel free to reach out to me and we will be sure to get the answers that you are looking for. Have a great night.